I am Athena Coleman. I am 27 years old. I sat at a polished mahogany dining table and listened to my mother call my doctoral thesis a useless science project. She delivered this verdict to a room full of extended relatives while actively writing a $50,000 check to cover my older brother's overdue corporate lease. My father sat at the head of the table and nodded in agreement, advising me to abandon my academic fantasies and find a real job. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. They assumed I was a financial failure who would eventually need to be rescued. They did not know the synthetic enzyme I was engineering in a cramped university lab was currently under review by an international chemical board. They did not know that exactly 4 weeks later, a corporate acquisition director would offer me $25 million a year for the global patent rights. And they certainly did not know that when their own financial house of cards collapsed, they would be forced to sit across a legal table from the daughter they discarded and beg for a bailout. But I am getting ahead of myself. The fracture of the Coleman family did not begin with a corporate contract. It began with a Sunday dinner. Welcome back to Senior Echo Stories, quiet narratives about people who survived the shadows and built their own empires while no one was watching. If your family ever diminished your genuine hard work to protect the ego of a golden child, this story is for you. Drop a comment telling me your location and what time it is there right now. I read every single one. Now hit that subscribe button and let me walk you through the anatomy of a family that gambled their legacy on an illusion. Suburban Ohio is filled with sprawling houses that serve as monuments to appearances. The Coleman residence was a prime example. The dining room was staged with imported porcelain and silver cutlery. I sat at the far edge of the table wearing a thrifted sweater and worn shoes that I used in the laboratory. I was exactly 3 weeks away from defending my doctorate in applied biochemistry. I had survived the last 4 years on minimal grant stipends and chronic sleep deprivation. My father, Richard, poured himself a glass of expensive red wine. He did not ask about my upcoming defense. He directed his attention to the opposite side of the table. My brother Preston sat there wearing a crisp linen shirt. Preston ran a lifestyle marketing firm in downtown Columbus. He possessed no actual marketing experience. He had no paying clients. He had a rented corner office and an aesthetic social media feed. My parents recently liquidated a large segment of their retirement portfolio to keep his firm afloat. They funded his empty operation because it provided them with a glamorous talking point at their country club. Aunt Clara sat near the center of the table and politely asked when my graduation ceremony would take place. My mother Evelyn set her wine glass down. She let out a long, rehearsed sigh. It was the exact exhalation she used whenever she needed to signal that I was a burden. Athena is still working on her little science project, Evelyn announced to the table. Her tone was patronizing. She is wasting her 20s hiding in a laboratory instead of entering the real world. It is quite sad, honestly. Look at Preston. He is building a network. He is an entrepreneur. Richard nodded. He swallowed his wine and fixed me with a stern look. A degree in biodegradable plastics does not pay the rent, Athena, he said. You need to abandon this academic bubble. You cannot rely on university handouts forever. It is time you started contributing to the Coleman name the way your brother does. I looked at my father. I looked at Preston, who was busy checking his reflection in his smartphone screen. The hypocrisy was a tangible object in the room. They demanded financial independence from the daughter who funded her own existence while subsidizing a luxury lifestyle for a son who produced zero revenue. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my research. Arguing with a narcissistic family unit is a losing metric. They require your defensive energy to validate their superiority. I recognized the dynamic for what it was. It was a failing corporate structure attempting to shift its liabilities. I treated their mockery as a sterile data point. I picked up my fork and continued my meal in silence, knowing the variables in this equation were about to change forever. The sterile hum of the university laboratory provided a sharp contrast to the suffocating theater of the Sunday dinner table. It was Monday morning. I stood under rows of harsh fluorescent lights, staring at the digital readout on an industrial centrifuge. The air smelled of sanitized stainless steel and agar solution. This room was my sanctuary. It was the only environment where my output was measured by objective metrics rather than emotional manipulation. My vision blurred slightly from chronic sleep deprivation. I had operated on 4 hours of sleep a night for the past 3 years. Surviving in the shadows requires a relentless expenditure of physical energy. You cannot afford the luxury of rest when you are funding your own existence. I calibrated the temperature controls for the next phase of testing. I was not working on a mere science project. I was finalizing the architectural framework of a synthetic microbial enzyme. My daily routine consisted of isolating specific bacterial strains and exposing them to high-density industrial plastics. The chemistry was complex, but the commercial application was brutally simple. Standard polyethylene terephthalate packaging requires over 4 centuries to decompose in a traditional landfill. The biological catalyst I engineered was currently breaking down those same synthetic polymers into harmless organic matter in exactly 18 days. I was standing on the precipice of a paradigm shift in global waste management. My motivation was stripped of any desire to impress my parents. I operated on the pure survival logic of securing a marketable patent. I treated their continuous rejection as a fixed variable in my life equation. It was a baseline metric I simply factored into my daily calculations. Funding this research required a level of financial discipline my family could never comprehend. Over the past 4 years, I authored dozens of independent grant proposals. I secured a modest university stipend that equaled $22,000 a year. That strict budget covered my tuition, my research materials, and my rent. I lived in a cramped 300-square-foot studio apartment located directly adjacent to the interstate highway. The thin walls offered zero insulation. The floorboards vibrated every time a commercial freight truck drove past the building. I ate cheap rice and beans. I purchased my winter coats from local thrift stores. I accounted for every single dollar in a heavily encrypted spreadsheet. The financial reality of my daily life stood in glaring opposition to the existence enjoyed by my older brother. Preston did not live near an interstate. He resided in a luxury loft condominium in the center of downtown Columbus. His building featured a private rooftop terrace and a dedicated concierge service. The monthly rent for his unit was $3,500. Preston did not pay a single cent of that balance. My father Richard and my mother Evelyn authorized a direct transfer from their primary checking account to his landlord on the first day of every month. They did not classify this as enabling a grown adult. They categorized it as a strategic investment in his executive presence. They believed a founder required a premium environment to attract elite venture capital. The structural hypocrisy of the Coleman family dynamic was staggering to observe. Narcissistic family systems do not operate on mathematical logic. They operate on emotional subsidies. My parents demanded extreme fiscal conservatism from the daughter who cost them $0. They scrutinized my thrifted clothing and told me to find a real job while simultaneously functioning as an unrestricted treasury for a son who produced zero revenue. They funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into the black hole of his ego. I understood the mechanics of their behavior. They needed Preston to succeed to validate their own parenting and their social status. My competence was an insult to their investment strategy. Acknowledging my hard work would force them to recognize the profound waste of his lifestyle. They preferred the comfort of their delusion to the discomfort of reality. The digital timer on my centrifuge chimed, signaling the completion of the cycle. I reached for a pair of latex gloves. My mobile phone vibrated on the metal prep counter. The caller identification displayed the name of my younger sister, Audrey. Audrey was 24 years old. She held the unofficial title of brand ambassador for Preston's marketing firm. Her actual daily responsibilities consisted of fetching expensive coffee orders, amplifying his hollow buzzwords, and acting as the loyal enforcer for my parents. When my father and mother did not want to soil their hands with direct confrontation, they dispatched Audrey to apply peer pressure. I answered the call, keeping my voice neutral. I asked her what she needed. Audrey did not offer a greeting. She launched directly into a stream of frantic demands. She told me I needed to leave the university immediately and drive to a boutique art gallery in the Arts District. Preston was hosting a pop-up networking mixer designed to secure seed funding from local angel investors. The event was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and the hired catering staff was severely underprepared. Audrey informed me that they needed manual labor to arrange the charcuterie boards, organize the folding chairs, and manage the guest registration table. She ordered me to abandon my laboratory schedule to serve as an unpaid assistant. I held the phone to my ear and looked at the centrifuge. The current batch of synthetic enzymes represented 4 months of meticulous gene editing. The biological samples required precise temperature stabilization and continual monitoring every 15 minutes for the next 6 hours. Walking away from the prep counter meant introducing thermal shock to the proteins. It meant destroying an entire fiscal quarter of verified data. The math was definitive. Ruining a critical scientific yield to fold napkins for a vaporware company was an illogical transaction. I am running a time-sensitive thermal protocol, I told her. My tone was flat and devoid of apology. I cannot leave the campus today. Audrey let out a sharp sigh of exasperation. The sound was an exact replica of the noise my mother made at the dinner table. You are always so selfish, Athena, she snapped. This is the most important day of Preston's career. He has real investors showing up. We are operating in crisis mode right now, and we need extra hands. Family supports family. I analyzed her weaponization of the word family. In their vocabulary, family was a synonym for compliance. Family meant sacrificing my resources to pave the road for his comfort. My thesis defense is in 3 weeks, I replied. I cannot pause my doctorate to act as a catering assistant for a marketing mixer. Preston will have to set up his own chairs. You are acting like your little school project is more important than an actual business, Audrey fired back. Her voice rose in pitch, reflecting her inability to handle a boundary. Dad is going to be furious when I tell him you refuse to help us. You are making a huge mistake. I am terminating this call, I stated. I pressed the end button on the screen. I did not wait for her final threat. I placed the device face down on the stainless steel counter. I pulled on my latex gloves and returned my focus to the chemical samples. I felt a brief surge of adrenaline, but it dissipated quickly into a cold, calculating calm. I understood the precise nature of the boundary I just established. In a functional household, declining a last-minute request for manual labor is a simple scheduling conflict. In the Coleman household, telling the golden child no is an act of treason. The scapegoat is never permitted to prioritize her own trajectory over the convenience of the favored son. By hanging up the phone, I did not just avoid a catering shift. I disrupted their entire chain of command. I knew Audrey would immediately report my insubordination to Richard and Evelyn. The structural balance of their preferred narrative was threatened. The machinery of family retribution was already turning its gears. They would not accept a simple refusal. The rejection would trigger a coordinated escalation, and I knew the formal summons was imminent. The expected retaliation arrived exactly 48 hours after I disconnected the phone call with Audrey. I received a calendar invitation in my personal email inbox. The subject line read Mandatory Family Alignment. It was scheduled for 7 in the evening on Wednesday at the Ohio estate. I did not feel a spike of anxiety. I secured my bacterial cultures in the temperature-controlled refrigeration unit and logged my data for the day. I drove my 10-year-old sedan out of the university parking lot and navigated the interstate toward the wealthy suburbs. I parked on the street, avoiding the repaved driveway. I walked through the heavy oak front door and found my parents waiting in the formal living room. The space was designed to intimidate. Richard stood near the stone fireplace holding a crystal glass of scotch. Evelyn sat on the white leather sofa with her posture rigidly straight. Preston and Audrey were noticeably absent. My parents preferred to conduct their interrogations without witnesses. They liked to control the narrative environment. I took a seat in a velvet armchair opposite my mother. I kept my winter coat on. I did not lean back. I treated the living room like a hostile corporate boardroom. Richard initiated this conversation. He bypassed any standard greeting or polite preamble. He adopted the measured authoritative tone of a chief executive delivering a critical performance review. He informed me that Preston's lifestyle marketing firm was entering a phase of rapid expansion. He claimed the pop-up networking mixer generated immense interest from local angel investors, and the company required immediate operational scaling. Richard stated that Preston possessed the visionary talent but lacked the logistical bandwidth to handle the back-office management. He looked directly at me and delivered his proposed solution. They wanted me to step in as the lead operations manager for the firm. Evelyn leaned forward to outline the specifics of this alleged opportunity. She spoke with a manufactured enthusiasm designed to mask the underlying extortion. She explained that a growing startup required lean resource management. Therefore, my new position would not offer a financial salary. I would be providing sweat equity. Evelyn framed this as a profound honor. She told me it was a rare chance to finally attach myself to a venture that carried actual prestige. She insisted it was an opportunity to contribute something of value to the Coleman name. There was an additional condition attached to the offer. The role required my undivided attention. My mother dictated that I must formally withdraw from my doctoral program the following morning. She called my degree a useless distraction that was holding the family back. I sat in the velvet armchair and analyzed the architecture of their demand. On the surface, it looked like a delusional request for free labor. Beneath the surface, it was a textbook maneuver utilized by enmeshed family structures. A golden child is given limitless capital, but lacks the fundamental grit to build a functional enterprise. When the venture inevitably begins bleeding cash, the family system panics. They cannot acknowledge the golden child's incompetence, because it reflects their own poor judgment and threatens their social standing. Instead, they attempt to absorb the competence of the scapegoat. They intended to extract my discipline, my organizational skills, and my relentless work ethic to construct a hidden foundation beneath Preston's hollow empire. I would manage the spreadsheets, handle the logistics, and stop the financial bleeding while Preston stood on the stage and accepted the applause. They were asking me to serve as the invisible structural support for a failing facade. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. I processed the sheer audacity of their posturing. They were demanding I throw away 4 years of grueling biochemical research to manage a bankrupt marketing stunt. I did not sigh. I did not raise my voice to match their implied authority. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I declined the offer, I stated. My voice was sterile and flat. I have a thesis defense to prepare for next week. I am not available to manage Preston's back office. The silence that followed my refusal was thick and suffocating. Richard stopped swirling the scotch in his glass. Evelyn uncrossed her legs. Manipulators operate on a very specific script. When they issue a command, they expect one of two reactions. They expect immediate compliance born from a desperate desire to earn their approval. If compliance is denied, they expect a highly emotional defense. They want the target to cry or shout or offer frantic justifications. Emotional volatility proves that their opinion still dictates the victim's reality. It proves the tether is still intact. They do not know how to process total clinical indifference. My flat refusal crashed their internal software. I treated their grand family investment like an unwanted telemarketing pitch. The shock on my father's face quickly morphed into a dark, rigid anger. He placed his glass on the mantel with a sharp clink. Evelyn intervened before he could speak. She resorted to the final mechanism of control they possessed. When manipulation fails, an abuser searches for leverage. Over the past 4 years, I had systematically eliminated my financial dependence on them. I paid my own rent and bought my own food. There was only one remaining thread tying me to their treasury. I remained listed as a dependent on my father's premium corporate health insurance policy. Evelyn weaponized it without hesitation. "If you turn your back on this family, we will terminate your medical coverage tomorrow morning," she warned. Her tone was sharp and coated in venom. "You will be entirely on your own, Athena. You will see how far your little science project gets you when you have to pay for your own doctor visits out of pocket. You are making a terrible mistake." Evelyn smiled a tight, triumphant smile. She believed she had located the critical pressure point. She assumed the threat of medical debt would force a young student living on a minimal grant stipend into immediate submission. She thought the fear of the unknown would break my resolve. I looked at her confident expression. I did not flinch. "I will process the policy cancellation paperwork on my end," I replied. I stood up from the velvet armchair. I did not offer a counter-argument. I did not ask for a grace period or attempt to negotiate terms. I accepted the loss of the asset without a single trace of hesitation. The triumph on my mother's face vanished instantly. The color drained from her cheeks. I turned my back on them and walked toward the foyer. Richard demanded I stop walking, but his voice lacked its usual commanding weight. It sounded hollow and desperate. They realized the gravity of the exchange they just initiated. By surrendering the insurance policy, I neutralized their final piece of leverage. The control mechanism was broken. They had nothing left to hold over my head. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the cool evening air. I walked down the driveway toward my faded sedan. I was walking away from their toxic system forever. I started the ignition of my car. The engine sputtered before settling into a low hum. I drove away from the manicured lawns and the sprawling houses that masked so much quiet desperation. The dashboard lights cast a faint glow inside the cabin. I did not feel fear regarding the loss of my medical coverage. Fear is a reaction to unexpected variables. I had anticipated this exact scenario months ago. I knew that rejecting their demands would eventually result in a total financial quarantine. I drove back toward the university district. The skyline of Columbus appeared in the distance. My parents were trapped in a cycle of their own making. They were pouring water into a leaking bucket and demanding I serve as the sealant. They were terrified of the upcoming financial quarter. Preston's pop-up mixer did not generate angel investment. It only generated catering bills and venue rental fees. My father knew his retirement accounts could not sustain another massive withdrawal. They needed a free employee to audit the books and halt the spending. They needed me to perform the labor while Preston continued to play the role of the visionary founder. I parked my car outside my apartment building. The industrial washing machines from the basement level vibrated through the concrete floor. I walked up the exterior stairs and unlocked my door. I sat at my small desk and opened my laptop. I did not search for entry-level marketing strategies to appease my family. I logged into the university portal and initiated the transfer to the basic student health plan. I typed my digital signature and hit submit. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes to sever a lifetime of conditional support. The room was quiet. The silence was not oppressive. It was expansive. I looked at the digital files containing the genomic sequencing of my synthetic enzyme. The chemistry was flawless. The testing phases were complete. I possessed an invention capable of restructuring an entire global industry. I just needed the structural capital to protect it from corporate theft. My parents thought I was a helpless academic. They were about to discover I was an architect preparing to build an empire. The conflict was escalating rapidly, but the battlefield was shifting away from their suburban living room. I closed my laptop. Tomorrow I would drive north. I needed to speak with Grandpa Silas. The next morning, I walked into the biochemistry building before the sun cleared the horizon. The air was crisp, and the campus was empty. I swiped my access card and entered the sterile white environment of the laboratory. My heart rate was steady. I did not feel the lingering anxiety that usually follows a major family confrontation. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The tether was cut. I logged into my terminal and reviewed the final sequencing data for the microbial catalyst. The numbers were irrefutable. The degradation cycle was confirmed at exactly 18 days. I exported the files and began compiling the technical documentation required for a patent application. Filing a patent is a grueling bureaucratic process. Securing a domestic patent is expensive, but securing global intellectual property rights requires a staggering amount of capital. You have to pay filing fees in multiple international jurisdictions and retain specialized legal counsel to defend the claims against corporate infringement. I possessed the science, but I lacked the funding. I needed an investor. I did not need an angel investor who cared about social media engagement or lifestyle branding. I needed a strategist who understood raw industrial value. I packed my laptop into my bag. I left the campus and merged onto Interstate 71, driving north toward Cleveland. The manicured lawns of suburban Columbus quickly gave way to the sprawling agricultural fields of northern Ohio. The transition in the landscape mirrored the shift in my objective. I was heading to see Silas Coleman. Silas was my grandfather. He was 82 years old and he lived alone on a 200-acre farm. He was the original architect of the family wealth. Decades ago, Silas built a regional freight logistics company from the ground up. He started with 2 rusted diesel trucks and expanded his operation into a fleet of 500 vehicles, dominating the Midwest shipping corridors. He possessed a ruthless work ethic and a brilliant analytical mind. My father Richard inherited the dividends of that logistics empire, but he inherited none of the grit. Richard and Evelyn viewed Silas as a relic of a bygone era. They treated him like a senile antique who belonged in an assisted living facility. They assumed his intellect was fading simply because he preferred the quiet isolation of his farm over the loud, ostentatious dinners at their country club. They only tolerated the 2-hour drive north when they needed to manipulate him into releasing early advances from his estate trust. They used his money to fund their illusions while dismissing the man who earned it. I was the only person in the family who visited him without a hidden agenda. I drove up to the farm just to sit on his wooden porch and drink coffee. I parked my faded sedan near a large red barn on the edge of the property. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I found Silas in his woodworking shed. He wore denim overalls and a flannel shirt. He was running a piece of raw oak through a table saw. The loud mechanical whine of the blade filled the shed. He turned off the machine when he saw me approach. He wiped sawdust from his calloused hands. His eyes were sharp and clear. He did not ask why I was visiting on a Thursday afternoon. He simply pointed to a wooden workbench and waited for me to speak. I did not offer a fabricated business plan. I did not use marketing buzzwords or attempt to charm him. I unpacked my laptop and placed it directly on the dusty workbench. I opened the encrypted spreadsheets containing my 4 years of research. I explained the genetic modification of the bacteria. I detailed the chemical breakdown of the polymers. I spoke to him in terms of volume processing capabilities, degradation rates, and industrial application. Silas listened in total silence. He leaned over the screen and studied the cascading rows of data. He possessed an intrinsic understanding of global supply chains. He knew the exact cost physical goods incurred from the moment they were manufactured to the moment they entered a landfill. He understood that commercial packaging was a multi-billion-dollar liability for major corporations. Environmental regulations were tightening worldwide, and companies were desperate for a disposal solution that did not involve incineration. "You built a microbe that eats synthetic trash," he said. His voice was gravelly and low. "I built an enzyme that dismantles the molecular bonds of polyethylene terephthalate in 18 days," I corrected him. "It leaves behind a biodegradable residue that can be utilized as agricultural fertilizer. It solves the disposal bottleneck for every major shipping conglomerate on the planet." Silas stood up straight. He looked at me with an intensity that Richard had never managed to muster. The patriarch of the Coleman family saw past the thrifted sweater and the dark circles under my eyes. He saw the architect. He recognized the commercial scale of the invention. He did not offer me a warm hug. He did not offer hollow parental praise. He offered cold strategic execution. "Filing this under your own name in a domestic registry is a mistake," Silas stated. He walked over to a metal tool cabinet and retrieved a clean shop towel. Corporate chemical giants employ legions of attorneys dedicated to burying independent inventors in litigation. They will drag you into civil court, challenge your data, and bleed your resources dry until you surrender the rights for pennies. You do not need a standard patent. You need an ironclad corporate fortress. I asked him how to build that fortress. Silas outlined the strategy with the precision of a military general. He proposed retaining a specialized intellectual property firm in Chicago. They would establish a blind trust and register a holding company in Delaware. The holding company would possess the global patent rights shielding my identity and my personal assets from corporate predators. Silas would serve as the silent financial backer. He offered to provide the initial capital required to cover the exorbitant international filing fees and the legal retainers. He did not ask for equity in the enzyme. He considered it a necessary correction to the financial waste his son was perpetuating in Columbus. We executed the maneuver over the next 10 days in absolute secrecy. I signed the retainer agreements. The Chicago legal team filed the international protections under the Delaware Shell Corporation. The intellectual property was locked, secured, and legally recognized across global jurisdictions. Silas wired the funds directly from a private account that Richard and Evelyn did not know existed. I returned to my routine in Columbus. The contrast between my reality and the reality of my family grew sharper by the hour. My parents and my sister continued to send passive-aggressive text messages. They mocked my academic stubbornness and predicted my imminent financial collapse. They assumed I was starving in my tiny apartment, regretting my decision to walk away from their medical insurance. They genuinely believed I was a helpless student drowning in a useless science project. They did not realize I had just fortified a global empire. I watched their digital insults populate on my phone screen and felt nothing but a quiet, calculating patience. I let them believe they held the high ground. The silence on my end was deliberate. The trap was fully constructed and waiting in the dark. The waiting period did not last long. The fabricated ecosystem surrounding my brother was rapidly running out of oxygen. 2 weeks later, Preston hosted another networking event and failed to secure a single dollar of seed funding. The catering invoices piled up, and his commercial landlord issued a final warning for the overdue rent. The parents realized their personal credit lines were entirely exhausted. The golden child was finally hitting a solid brick wall, and the fallout was going to force them to search for a new target to absorb the impact. May arrived bringing the humid onset of an Ohio summer and the scheduled date of my doctoral commencement. The changing season also delivered the mathematical certainty of my brother's ruin. A hollow business model can only survive on borrowed oxygen for a limited duration. Preston's lifestyle marketing firm finally reached the end of its runway. The collapse was not a slow leak. It was a structural failure. He had spent the last 8 months hosting lavish networking mixers and leasing premium office space without signing a single paying client. To maintain the appearance of an expanding empire, he needed capital that my parents could no longer provide from their liquid accounts. Unbeknownst to Richard and Evelyn, he had circumvented their drained retirement funds by forging a secondary signature. He secured a substantial commercial line of credit. He used the equity of our parents' sprawling suburban estate as the collateral. The bank underwriters approved the loan based on the inflated property appraisal and Preston's fabricated revenue projections. He burned through the cash in less than a fiscal quarter. The final blow arrived on a Tuesday morning. The one local angel investor who had shown marginal interest in the firm requested to view the actual software architecture of Preston's marketing platform. Preston had no software. He had graphic design mock-ups and a purchased list of fake social media followers. The investor realized the company possessed 0 proprietary assets and formally withdrew all letters of intent. The notification of the investor pulling out coincided with the arrival of the first defaulted payment notice from the bank. The certified letter arrived in the mailbox at the suburban estate. Richard opened the envelope expecting a standard utility bill. Instead, he found a pre-foreclosure warning. The reality of the situation crashed into the Coleman household with the force of a freight train. My parents discovered that the golden child had not only failed to build a legacy, but had actively mortgaged the roof over their heads to fund his vanity. The facade of the wealthy country club family shattered. Evelyn could no longer pretend she was the matriarch of a thriving dynasty. Richard could no longer boast about his entrepreneurial son in the golf course clubhouse. They faced an immediate and severe liquidity crisis. They owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to a commercial lender, and they had less than 30 days to cure the default before the bank initiated public seizure protocols. In a rational environment, this crisis would prompt a harsh confrontation with the son who committed financial fraud. A normal father would demand accountability. A normal mother would force her son to liquidate his luxury loft and sell his designer wardrobe to mitigate the damage. My parents were not rational. Narcissistic enablers cannot punish the extension of their own ego. Punishing Preston would mean acknowledging their own catastrophic failure in judgment. It would mean admitting that the daughter they banished was the practical one. They chose denial over accountability. They decided they just needed a temporary bridge loan to fix the situation. They needed an emergency bailout, and there was only one remaining vault left to crack. Richard and Evelyn orchestrated a desperate campaign to secure the funds from Grandpa Silas. They spent 3 days crafting a fictional narrative. They generated a fabricated business plan that disguised Preston's staggering debt as a strategic corporate expansion opportunity. They printed glossy charts and bound the pages in premium leather folders. They intended to drive north to the farm and present this document to the patriarch. The psychology behind this maneuver requires careful examination. My parents genuinely believed they could outsmart Silas. They lived in an echo chamber of their own design where appearances dictated reality. Because Silas wore denim overalls and spent his days working with timber, they assumed he was financially illiterate. They forgot that the man sitting on a tractor had built a logistics network that spanned 5 states. They equated his rural lifestyle with intellectual weakness. They believed a leather-bound folder and a few rehearsed corporate phrases would bewitch an 82-year-old man into handing over his wealth. This shared delusion is the hallmark of entitled individuals. They chronically underestimate the intelligence of the people they intend to exploit. They arrived at the farm on a Friday afternoon. Silas was sitting on his wooden porch drinking a glass of iced tea. Richard and Evelyn marched up the wooden steps, projecting an aura of artificial confidence. They sat in the woven patio chairs and initiated their pitch. Richard spoke rapidly. He used words like market penetration and synergistic alignment. He handed the glossy folder to his father and explained that Preston was on the verge of a major industry breakthrough. Richard claimed the firm merely needed a temporary capital injection to scale operations and meet the overwhelming client demand. He asked for a specific dollar amount. The number was exactly equal to the defaulted bank loan. Silas set his iced tea down. He took the leather folder and opened it. He did not say a word for 10 minutes. He turned the pages slowly. He ignored the colorful pie charts and the meaningless mission statements. He scanned the raw numbers printed in the appendices. A man who spent 40 years managing fuel costs, shipping manifests, and supply chain logistics possesses an internal lie detector calibrated by hard mathematics. Silas looked at the projected overhead versus the listed assets. He looked at the burn rate Richard was trying to disguise as marketing expenditures. He closed the folder and placed it flat on the wooden table between them. "You are asking me to finance a hole in the ground," Silas said. His voice carried the rough, unyielding texture of crushed gravel. Richard blinked, a tight smile freezing on his face. He attempted to pivot back to his rehearsed script. "It is an investment, Dad," he insisted. "Preston is cornering a new demographic. The return yields will be exceptional once the initial scaling phase is complete." Silas leaned forward. "You are lying to my face, Richard," he stated. "You have a $0 valuation masquerading as a corporation. This document lists a monthly operating cost that exceeds the gross domestic product of a small town, but it lists 0 accounts receivable. There are no clients. There is no product. You did not come here to scale a business. You came here because the bank is preparing to take your house and you need me to cover your bad bet." Evelyn gasped, feigning deep insult. She pressed a hand to her chest. "How can you say that to your own son, Silas?" she asked. "We came to you because we wanted to keep this lucrative opportunity inside the family. Preston is brilliant. He just needs a little runway." Brilliance produces results, Silas replied. Delusion produces debt. You raised a boy who knows how to spend money but has no idea how to earn it. Now you are trying to hand me a fabricated ledger to pay off whatever predatory loan he signed to fund his suits and his cars. I built my company by evaluating risk. Funding incompetence is not a sound investment strategy. The patriarch delivered his verdict with cold finality. He did not shout. He did not express anger. He simply rejected their fraud with forensic precision. He handed the leather folder back to Richard and told them they had a long drive back to Columbus. My parents sat frozen on the porch. The rejection was total and unambiguous. Their entire strategy dissolved into the humid afternoon air. They could not manipulate him. They could not shame him into compliance. Silas saw straight through their suburban camouflage and exposed the rotting wood underneath. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. Richard grabbed the folder. He stood up without a word. Evelyn followed him, her face pale and tight. They walked back to their luxury vehicle and drove away from the farm with empty hands and a looming foreclosure. The drive south was silent. The structural void in their finances was now a gaping chasm. The golden child had ruined them. The patriarch had rejected them. The bank was circling their estate. A toxic family system facing imminent destruction behaves like a cornered predator. It scans the environment for an easy target to consume. They needed a bailout. They needed someone who possessed an innate sense of responsibility. They needed someone they had trained from birth to absorb their burdens. As the Columbus skyline appeared on the horizon, their panic slowly crystallized into a new predatory focus. They exhausted their upward options. It was time to look downward. It was time to summon the scapegoat back to the sacrificial altar. The university library offered a sterile, quiet sanctuary on the third floor. I sat at a corner desk surrounded by printed research journals and my laptop. It was Tuesday afternoon. My thesis defense was scheduled for the following week. I was reviewing the slide deck for my presentation. I checked the structural diagrams of the synthetic enzyme and verified the degradation metrics one final time. I needed the presentation to be flawless. The international patent was secured in a Delaware holding company, but the academic validation of the doctorate was the final key to unlocking the corporate market. My phone vibrated against the wooden surface of the desk. The screen illuminated. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I stared at the glowing device. Richard never called me during business hours. He rarely called me at all unless he needed to issue a command or relay an insult from my mother. The timing indicated a severe disruption in their daily routine. I knew the bank was moving forward with the foreclosure proceedings. I knew Silas had rejected their fabricated business proposal. They were running out of oxygen. I slid my finger across the glass and accepted the call. Richard did not offer a greeting. He spoke with a rushed, breathless urgency. The polished, authoritative cadence he used at the Sunday dinner table was gone. It was replaced by a frantic, manic energy. He told me the family was facing an unexpected cash flow delay. He used the word delay to describe a total financial default. He stated that Preston's marketing firm was on the verge of securing a monumental contract, but required an immediate influx of capital to bridge the gap. He said the bank was behaving unreasonably regarding the estate mortgage. He was weaving a chaotic narrative attempting to confuse the listener into compliance. Then he delivered the actual objective of the call. Richard instructed me to log into the federal student aid portal. He told me to apply for the maximum allowable graduate loan. He calculated that a postgraduate student could secure up to $60,000 in federal disbursements for living expenses and tuition. He demanded I apply for the loan that afternoon and wire the entire sum directly into Preston's corporate account. I sat in the quiet library and processed the mechanical structure of his demand. He was not asking for a favor. He was ordering me to commit federal financial fraud. He wanted me to take on decades of high-interest student debt for a non-existent degree program. He wanted me to hand that stolen federal money to a brother who would squander it in a matter of weeks. Richard framed this illegal maneuver as my biological duty. He claimed it was my responsibility to step up and protect the Coleman name from public embarrassment. He told me that family members must make sacrifices when the legacy is threatened. The psychology driving his request highlights the core pathology of a toxic family unit. Abusive parents do not view the independent success of the scapegoat as an achievement to be celebrated. They view it as an untapped reserve asset. They see clean credit and a lack of debt not as the result of hard work, but as a fresh line of credit they can exploit for the golden child. They assumed my spotless financial record was just another tool they could utilize to fix Preston's catastrophic mistakes. They believed they were entitled to my future earning potential. I treated the phone call like a corrupted line of code. When an algorithm encounters a toxic variable, it does not attempt to reason with the error. It simply isolates the error and terminates the process. I am not taking out a federal loan, I stated. My voice was low and perfectly even. I am not committing fraud to pay for Preston's failed marketing company. Richard let out a sharp breath. He attempted to raise his volume. He tried to pivot from persuasion to intimidation. He told me I was being an ungrateful daughter. He said I owed them for raising me. You raised a daughter who funds her own existence, I replied. Preston secured a loan against your house. Preston spent the money. Preston can figure out how to pay it back. Do not call this number again. I ended the call before he could formulate another threat. I placed the phone back on the desk. My pulse remained steady. I did not feel a shred of guilt. Guilt is an emotion reserved for individuals who have caused harm. I caused no harm. I simply refused to be the collateral damage in their self-inflicted explosion. I turned my attention back to my presentation slides and resumed my work. The rejection sent Richard into a state of unfiltered rage. A narcissist stripped of their control mechanism behaves like a cornered animal. They realize they cannot force the victim to comply, so they shift their objective. If they cannot control the victim, they will control how the world perceives the victim. My parents initiated a vicious public smear campaign to preemptively control the narrative before their financial ruin became public knowledge. Evelyn activated her network of country club friends and extended relatives. She spent the entire weekend making tearful phone calls. She fabricated a narrative that portrayed me as a greedy and deceitful villain. She told Aunt Clara that I had secretly hoarded thousands of dollars in academic grants while the family was struggling. She lied to her neighbors, claiming I had stolen money from my father's office to fund my selfish lifestyle. She painted Preston as a tragic hero who was doing everything in his power to save the family, while his cruel sister abandoned him in his darkest hour. The rumors spread through the suburban ecosystem with remarkable speed. People who thrive on drama rarely verify the facts before passing judgment. My cousins sent me angry text messages accusing me of being a traitor. Distant relatives who had not spoken to me in years suddenly felt entitled to lecture me about loyalty. The Coleman family closed ranks and designated me as the sole cause of their misery. They needed a scapegoat to blame for the impending foreclosure, and I was the designated target. Audrey executed the digital arm of the smear campaign. My younger sister functioned as the public relations manager for my parents' delusion. She took to social media to broadcast the fabricated narrative. She did not use my name directly. She employed the cowardice of passive-aggressive, vague posting. She uploaded long paragraphs about the pain of betrayal. She wrote about the heartbreak of discovering that toxic people can share your bloodline. She posted quotes about loyalty and sacrifice, tagging Preston in every update to highlight his artificial martyrdom. Her followers offered sympathy and validation, reinforcing the lie that the Coleman family was suffering due to my malicious behavior. I observed the digital footprint of their campaign from the quiet safety of my apartment. I watched the messages populate on my screen. I read the vicious rumors and the dramatic social media posts. The younger version of myself might have felt an overwhelming urge to correct the record. The old Athena might have drafted long emails defending my character and explaining the reality of Preston's debt. I might have tried to present the logical truth to relatives who had already decided I was guilty. The current version of myself recognized the trap. Engaging with a smear campaign validates the premise of the attack. It pulls you down into the mud and forces you to fight on their terms. Truth is a defense that requires a receptive audience. My extended family did not want the truth. They wanted a dramatic storyline. They wanted a villain so they could feel superior. I decided to give them nothing. I muted the text messages. I blocked Audrey's social media profiles. I locked my digital doors and severed the remaining communication lines. I let them scream into the void. I let Evelyn cry her artificial tears and let Audrey harvest her digital sympathy. Their lies possessed no actual currency in the world I was preparing to enter. The global corporate market does not care about suburban gossip. A multinational chemical board does not check the social media feed of a 24-year-old brand ambassador. The noise they generated was entirely irrelevant to my trajectory. The smear campaign served one final useful purpose. It solidified the permanent boundary between us. By publicly branding me as an enemy, they relieved me of any lingering societal obligation to pretend we were a family. They burned the bridge, and I was grateful for the fire. I spent the final days leading up to my defense in a state of total focus. I rehearsed my presentation. I reviewed the technical questions the panel might ask. I polished my shoes and pressed my modest blazer. The Colemans were busy fighting a war of illusions in the suburbs, while I was preparing to conquer the reality of the international market. The day of the thesis defense approached, and the variables were locked into place for the final separation. The morning of the thesis defense arrived with a sharp chill cutting through the Ohio spring air. I woke up at dawn inside my cramped studio apartment. The industrial washing machines on the ground floor were silent for once. I dressed in a dark tailored blazer I had purchased from a local consignment shop. I gathered my presentation materials and drove to the university campus. The biochemistry building stood like a concrete fortress against the rising sun. I walked through the heavy glass double doors and navigated the quiet hallways toward the main lecture hall. This room was designed for formal academic scrutiny. It featured tiered seating capable of holding 200 spectators and a central podium illuminated by harsh overhead spotlights. I connected my device to the digital projector and waited for the faculty panel to arrive. Nerves imply a fear of the unpredictable. I felt no fear. I possessed total certainty regarding the structural integrity of my data. 4 senior professors entered the hall and took their seats behind a long oak table facing the podium. Dr. Eris Thorne chaired the defense committee. He was a notoriously rigid academic who rarely offered praise and routinely dismantled graduate students who presented flawed methodology. He opened his leather portfolio and signaled for me to begin. I clicked the remote and illuminated the first slide. I spent the next 2 hours guiding the panel through the complex molecular architecture of the synthetic enzyme. I detailed the specific gene editing sequences required to stabilize the bacteria for large-scale commercial deployment. I displayed the empirical data proving the chemical breakdown of the polymers. I showed them time-lapse imaging of industrial polyethylene terephthalate degrading into a harmless organic residue. The formal interrogation phase began immediately after my final slide. The professors initiated a relentless series of questions. They probed the degradation timeline and challenged the thermal stability of the residual matter. I answered their inquiries with calm clinical precision. I provided the exact mathematical models proving the enzyme could operate efficiently on a broad industrial scale. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the oak table. He scrutinized the decay metrics displayed on the projection screen. The atmosphere in the lecture hall shifted. The room fell into a deep, calculating quiet. The professors exchanged subtle glances. They recognized they were not evaluating a standard graduate project. They were witnessing a technological shift that would render current waste management infrastructure obsolete. Dr. Thorne closed his leather portfolio. He did not ask me to step out into the hallway while the committee deliberated. He looked directly at me and granted me top departmental honors right there at the podium. I thanked the panel and packed my laptop into my bag. The professors gathered their notes and exited through the side door. I turned around to face the tiered seating area. The front 3 rows were specifically designated for the families of the defending candidates. I looked at the plush velvet chairs. Every single seat remained vacant. Richard, Evelyn Preston, and Audrey explicitly chose to boycott the most significant academic milestone of my life. Their absence was not a scheduling conflict or a simple oversight. It was a calculated punitive measure. They withheld their physical presence to penalize me for refusing to commit federal loan fraud on their behalf the previous week. They assumed the sight of those empty chairs would break my resolve. They believed their rejection would force me into a desperate apology and eventual compliance. I stood at the podium and analyzed the vacant room. The void they left behind did not generate sorrow. It generated a profound sociological clarity. An emotional orphan is a distinct classification of human experience. A biological orphan mourns individuals they lost to the cruelty of fate. An emotional orphan must mourn individuals who are still breathing but actively choosing to walk away. My parents were alive, but they were functionally dead to my needs. They chose to protect the fragile ego of a son who was currently bankrupting them rather than witness the earned triumph of their daughter. I did not cry. Tears serve as a biological mechanism to solicit comfort from a tribe. I possessed no tribe to solicit. I treated the empty rows of chairs as a finalized data point. The visual evidence confirmed that the biological tether was officially severed. I walked up the carpeted aisle and exited the lecture hall. I pushed through the heavy doors of the science building and stepped out into the bright sunlight. The campus buzzed with passing students and faculty members rushing to their morning classes. I navigated the concrete pathways alone. The isolation did not feel heavy. It felt like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. The suffocating weight of my family's expectations evaporated into the clear air. I walked to the parking structure and unlocked my faded sedan. I sat behind the steering wheel and looked at the university buildings in the rearview mirror. I had entered this institution as a scapegoat seeking validation through academic rigor. I was driving away as an independent architect. I merged onto the interstate and returned to my apartment. I unlocked the door and placed my bag on the small wooden desk. I did not celebrate my top honors with a lavish dinner or a gathering of friends. The quiet hustle demanded continued focus. I opened my laptop and connected to the secure server holding my legal correspondence. A single encrypted email sat in my inbox. It was dispatched from the specialized intellectual property firm in Chicago. I opened the message and read the attached digital documents. The international regulatory boards had formally approved the filings. The Delaware holding company now legally possessed the global patent rights to the synthetic enzyme. The legal documentation included the official registration numbers for the European Union, the Asian markets, and the domestic regulatory agencies. The coverage was comprehensive and airtight. No chemical manufacturer could replicate the bacterial strain without triggering an immediate intellectual property lawsuit. Grandpa Silas had financed an impenetrable legal perimeter. The corporate chemical giants who typically crush independent researchers were now forced to negotiate with a holding company they could not intimidate or outspend. The legal architecture was locked into place. I held the exclusive rights to an invention that would restructure the entire commercial packaging industry. The intellectual property was insulated from any external claims or familial interference. I closed the laptop screen. I retrieved 3 cardboard boxes from the closet and began packing my belongings. I folded the thrifted sweaters and stacked the worn textbooks. The juxtaposition of my physical environment and my legal status was stark. I stood in a tiny room packing cheap clothing while holding a corporate asset valued in the tens of millions. My phone remained silent on the desk. The smear campaign orchestrated by my mother had successfully alienated every extended relative in the state. There were no text messages asking how the defense went. There were no voicemails offering congratulations. The silence from the Coleman family was profound. In the past, that silence would have felt like a weapon designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Today it felt like the quiet hum of a functioning machine. The noise of their dysfunction was finally muted. Their dramatic social media posts and fabricated rumors held zero currency in the reality I now occupied. I did not need to defend my character to aunts and uncles who preferred a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth. I did not need to justify my choices to cousins who blindly supported Preston's fake empire. Letting go of the need to be understood by toxic people is the ultimate form of self-preservation. I deleted the remaining contact profiles from my phone. I erased their numbers and removed their digital access to my life. The separation was physical, emotional, and technological. The silence was the sound of unhindered freedom. I taped the cardboard boxes shut and reviewed the timeline of my immediate future. The university required my attendance at the formal commencement ceremony scheduled for the following week. The commencement represented the final logistical requirement of my degree. I knew my parents would likely attend the graduation event despite boycotting the defense. They would not attend to cheer for my success. They would attend because the university president hosted a prestigious networking reception for wealthy alumni immediately following the ceremony. Preston viewed that reception as a prime hunting ground. His marketing firm was drowning in the debt he secured against my parents' house. He needed a new investor to save him from the impending foreclosure. Richard and Evelyn needed to project an illusion of stability to their peers. They would use my graduation as a convenient excuse to access the wealthy donors in the reception hall. They assumed I would stand quietly in the corner and accept their neglect as they pitched his hollow business to unsuspecting venture capitalists. They did not understand the parameters of the environment they were entering. I placed the final box near the door. The trap was set for the following week, and I was ready to watch them walk directly into the jaws of the corporate market. 14 days passed in a state of quiet preparation. The formal commencement ceremony took place on a Saturday afternoon inside the main university stadium. The concrete arena radiated the heat of an early summer day. Thousands of relatives filled the bleachers holding printed programs and cheering for the graduating class. I sat in the front row reserved for doctoral candidates wearing a heavy synthetic black gown and a velvet hood. I listened to the monotonous voice of the university dean reading names over the public address system. The noise of the crowd washed over me. I did not scan the lower sections hoping to find my family. I knew exactly where they were located. The Colemans decided to attend the commencement. Their presence was not a gesture of reconciliation. They did not drive to the campus to celebrate my academic milestone or offer apologies for boycotting my defense. They endured the 2-hour ceremony in the stadium for a very specific logistical reason. The university president hosted an exclusive networking reception for wealthy alumni and regional business leaders immediately following the presentation of degrees. The guest list for that specific reception included venture capitalists, property developers, and elite corporate executives. It was an insulated ecosystem of concentrated wealth. Preston viewed that reception hall as a literal hunting ground. His marketing firm was running out of oxygen. The defaulted commercial loan tied to my parents' suburban estate hung over their heads like a descending blade. My brother needed a new investor to consume his toxic debt. He needed fresh capital to maintain his luxury loft and his designer wardrobe. Richard and Evelyn needed him to secure that funding to prevent the bank from seizing their primary residence. I walked across the wooden stage when the dean called my name. I accepted the leather folder containing my diploma and turned toward the audience for the official photograph. I looked up at the highest tier of the stadium seating. I spotted them sitting in the back row. Richard and Evelyn were performing a synchronized polite clap. They smiled for the benefit of the strangers sitting next to them, projecting the image of a supportive family. They wore expensive clothing they could no longer afford. Richard wore a tailored charcoal suit. Evelyn wore a silk designer dress. They were attempting to mask their impending financial ruin with premium fabric. They were actors playing a role for a crowd that did not care about them. I walked down the stairs and returned to my seat. The biological milestone meant nothing to them, but the structural reality of the degree meant everything to my future. The stadium emptied into the adjoining alumni center an hour later. The reception hall featured vaulted ceilings and tall glass windows overlooking the campus quadrangle. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the room, carrying silver trays of sparkling water and artisanal hors d'oeuvres. The room quickly filled with men and women wearing bespoke tailoring. These individuals evaluated risk and return metrics for a living. They did not speak in loud, boastful tones. True power operates at a very low volume. I stood near a corner catering table holding a glass of water. I observed my family enter the hall. Their arrival was a study in desperate projection. They walked with their heads held high, attempting to project an aura of effortless prosperity. They were drowning in commercial debt, yet they smiled as if they owned the building. Preston flanked them, holding a thick stack of glossy business cards. He scanned the room with the frantic intensity of a starving animal evaluating a herd. My brother was raised on a steady diet of unearned praise. From a young age, my parents told him he was a visionary. They shielded him from the consequences of his failures and funded his every whim. They taught him how to look like an entrepreneur, but they never taught him how to build a functional business. Now he was standing in a room full of actual executives, and his lack of substance was glaringly obvious. I watched Preston approach a group of older gentlemen standing near the marble bar. He deployed his practiced charismatic grin. He offered a firm handshake and launched into his pitch. He used phrases like brand optimization and market disruption. The older men exchanged brief, polite smiles. They recognized a hollow sales tactic within seconds. One of the men excused himself to check his phone, while another simply turned his back to resume a prior conversation. Preston was left standing alone, holding his useless card. The venture capital market possesses an immune system designed to reject empty posturing. Preston was a virus without a payload. My parents witnessed his failure from across the room. The rejection bruised their collective ego. A narcissistic family unit cannot process a public defeat without redirecting the negative energy onto a safe target. They needed someone to belittle to restore their internal hierarchy. They needed a punching bag to regulate their shame. Richard scanned the room and locked his eyes on me. He nudged Evelyn. The three of them navigated through the crowd and cornered me against the catering table. They formed a physical barrier, cutting off my exit route. Evelyn spoke first. She did not lower her voice to accommodate the quiet, professional atmosphere of the reception. She spoke loudly, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear her maternal reprimand. "Well, Athena, you finally finished your little science project," she announced. Her tone dripped with synthetic sweetness, masking a sharp edge. "I hope you are planning to utilize that expensive piece of paper. The job market is very competitive right now. You should start looking for entry-level laboratory technician roles immediately. Perhaps you can find something paying minimum wage to help offset the cost of raising you." Richard took a sip of his drink and leaned closer. He invaded my personal space, attempting to exert physical dominance. "Your mother is right," he stated. "You have lived in an academic fantasy for too long. It is time to enter the real world and generate some actual revenue. You cannot hide behind test tubes forever. Real success requires networking and building tangible assets like your brother is doing." I looked at Preston. He stood slightly behind my father, projecting a smug expression. He had just been dismissed by a group of genuine investors, but he eagerly embraced the opportunity to stand tall on the wreckage of my supposed failure. His confidence was entirely dependent on my subjugation. If I was a struggling student, he could pretend he was a thriving entrepreneur. They required my poverty to validate their wealth. They needed my struggle to justify their entitlement. The dynamic was as predictable as a mathematical formula. I did not react to the provocation. I held my glass of water and maintained a calm, neutral expression. Defending my earning potential would only invite a debate I had no intention of having. I analyzed their behavior through the lens of a corporate auditor viewing a distressed asset. They were standing in a room full of millionaires issuing financial advice while their primary residence was days away from a public auction. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They were projecting superiority while standing on a trapdoor they had built themselves. "I understand your perspective," I replied. My voice was quiet and level. "I will keep my career options open." Evelyn scoffed. She turned to Richard and rolled her eyes. She is impossible, Evelyn muttered loud enough for the passing waiters to hear. We try to give her practical guidance and she just stares blankly. This is why Preston carries the business acumen in the family. She lacks the drive to succeed in a corporate environment. I let them enjoy their temporary victory. I let Evelyn bask in her loud public reprimand. I let Richard feel the rush of patriarchal authority. I let Preston cling to his fragile illusion of superiority. They believed they held all the cards in the room. They thought they had successfully re-established the old family dynamic by diminishing my doctoral achievement in a public setting. They were entirely unaware that the environment they were currently trying to manipulate did not belong to them. They assumed I was standing near the catering table to hide from the crowd. They did not know I was standing there waiting for a scheduled corporate meeting. I shifted my gaze past my father's shoulder and looked toward the main entrance of the Alumni Center. The heavy wooden doors swung open. The atmosphere in the room was about to undergo a severe pressure change. The trap they walked into was fully primed. I took a slow sip of my water and waited for the variables to shift. The heavy wooden doors of the Alumni Center swung open, and the ambient noise in the reception hall dipped for a fraction of a second. A man walked through the entrance. He wore a slate gray suit constructed with quiet precision. His name was Nolan. He operated as the senior acquisition director for a global chemical manufacturing conglomerate. His daily responsibilities involved identifying, securing, and purchasing disruptive technologies across international borders. He carried the authority of a corporate board that managed billions of dollars in liquid assets. He navigated the crowded room with predatory efficiency. He did not look at the buffet tables. He did not offer polite nods to the local business owners or the university donors. He scanned the room searching for a specific target. My father possessed a finely tuned radar for corporate wealth. He spent his entire adult life trying to mimic the posture of the elite. Richard spotted the man in the slate gray suit immediately. His eyes locked onto the small metallic lapel pin fastened to Nolan's jacket. It was the recognizable geometric logo of the chemical conglomerate. I watched my father's mind process the variables. The Colemans were suffocating under commercial debt. The bank was preparing to seize their estate. Preston desperately needed an investor to prevent a total financial collapse. Richard assumed this senior executive was attending a university reception to scout fresh marketing talent for a new corporate campaign. It was a delusional leap of logic, but desperate people build bridges out of thin air. Richard elbowed my brother. He pointed discreetly toward the approaching executive. He whispered an urgent instruction into Preston's ear. My father physically pushed his golden child forward. He positioned Preston directly in the path of the acquisition director. This was the moment they had trained for since his childhood. This was the validation they craved. They believed Preston's manufactured charm could secure a lucrative corporate contract and save the suburban estate from foreclosure. Preston intercepted Nolan near the center of the marble floor. He deployed his practiced smile. It was the same hollow smile he used to secure the fraudulent line of credit against my parents' house. He extended his hand and initiated his elevator pitch. He spoke with loud, unearned confidence. He introduced himself as the visionary founder of a premier lifestyle marketing firm. He offered to optimize the chemical conglomerate's brand synergy. He promised to deliver targeted demographic integration and disrupt their traditional media outreach. He strung together a series of hollow venture capital buzzwords. He sounded like an algorithm reciting a motivational speech. Nolan stopped walking. He did not shake my brother's hand. He did not offer a polite business smile. The senior executive looked at Preston with an expression of cold, clinical confusion. He analyzed the man standing in front of him. Nolan spent his career evaluating tangible assets. He bought industrial factories. He purchased supply chain logistics. He acquired patented intellectual property. He did not buy brand synergy. He looked at Preston's expensive linen shirt and heard the terror hiding beneath the buzzwords. The corporate market operates on a ruthless binary system. An asset either holds verifiable value or it represents a toxic liability. The market does not care about your curated social media presence. The market does not care that your parents drained their retirement accounts to fund your luxury loft. The market only respects utility and revenue. Preston offered neither. He was a liability wrapped in an expensive suit. He was a localized illusion attempting to cast a shadow in a global arena. Nolan did not raise his voice. He did not need to exert dominance. He simply stated a fact. "Step aside," Nolan said. The two words sliced through the ambient noise of the reception hall. The rejection was public. It was devastating. Preston froze. His outstretched hand dropped to his side. The confident smile melted off his face, leaving behind the terrified expression of a boy who had just been caught lying. He looked small and entirely powerless. Richard and Evelyn watched the exchange from their corner near the catering table. The blood drained from my father's face. Evelyn clutched her designer handbag as her jaw tightened. The golden child was just evaluated by a genuine arbiter of wealth, and he was found entirely worthless. The protective bubble my parents built around him popped in front of a room full of millionaires. They could no longer pretend he was a rising star. The reality of his incompetence was broadcasted to the exact demographic they worshipped. Nolan did not wait for Preston to recover his composure. He stepped around my brother as if Preston were a piece of discarded furniture blocking a hallway. The executive resumed his trajectory. He walked directly toward the corner catering table. Richard straightened his posture. My father assumed Nolan was approaching the older generation to apologize for dismissing the son. Richard prepared his own sycophantic greeting. He adjusted his tie and stepped forward to intercept the executive, hoping to salvage the interaction. Nolan bypassed my father. He bypassed my mother. He ignored the people who had spent the past 27 years demanding to be the center of attention. He stopped directly in front of me. The man who controlled billions of dollars in acquisition capital extended his hand toward the daughter the Colemans had just advised to seek minimum wage employment. I looked at the extended hand. The power dynamic of my entire existence was about to be rewritten. For decades, my family defined my worth. They labeled my research a useless science project. They called my academic dedication a failure to enter the real world. They forced me to sit in the shadows while they poured their resources into a mirage. They thought they controlled the narrative because they controlled the suburban gossip. They did not understand that true power is not built on rumors or parental approval. True power is built on irrefutable data. I placed my glass of water on the catering table. I reached out and shook Nolan's hand. His grip was firm and professional. The silence surrounding our corner of the reception hall grew heavy. Richard and Evelyn stood frozen, staring at the interaction with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They watched the senior acquisition director treat their scapegoat with a level of professional respect they had never achieved in their own lives. The hierarchy they carefully maintained was disintegrating. They were forced to witness the exact moment their designated failure was recognized as a premium asset. The validation they desperately sought for Preston was being handed to the daughter they banished. The suburban illusion was dead. The corporate reality had arrived to collect its due. I maintained a calm, neutral expression as I held Nolan's gaze. I was ready to finalize the transaction that would alter the trajectory of the Coleman family forever. I held the hand of the senior acquisition director. His grip was firm and measured. The ambient chatter of the alumni reception hall continued to hum around us for a few brief seconds. My parents stood inches away, frozen in their aggressive posture. They still operated under the assumption that they controlled the social environment. They waited for Nolan to realize his mistake and turn his attention back to their golden son. They waited for the corporate executive to dismiss me, the same way they had dismissed me my entire life. Nolan did not turn away. He looked directly at me and spoke with clear, unhurried projection. "Dr. Coleman," he said. The title hung in the air above the catering table. My mother had just referred to my academic career as an expensive piece of paper. My father had just commanded me to find a minimum wage position. Nolan neutralized their insults with 2 words. He addressed me with the formal respect earned through grueling scientific rigor. The venture capitalists and regional business owners standing nearby paused their conversations. They recognized Nolan's slate gray suit and the corporate pin on his lapel. They understood that a man of his stature did not approach a recent graduate to offer polite small talk. The radius of silence slowly expanded outward from our corner of the room. My board of directors spent the last 48 hours reviewing the intellectual property filings registered to your Delaware holding company, Nolan continued. His voice carried the authoritative cadence of a man who finalized sovereign wealth transactions. We examined the independent testing data regarding your biodegradable polymer enzyme. The structural sequencing is immaculate. Richard frowned. The patriarchal authority began to leak from his posture. My father did not understand the terminology, but he recognized the tone. He recognized the language of high-level commerce. Evelyn stared at Nolan with her lips slightly parted. The synthetic sweetness she deployed moments earlier melted into an expression of profound confusion. They were listening to an industry titan praise the useless science project they had mocked at the Sunday dinner table. Nolan did not pause to accommodate their confusion. He transitioned smoothly from scientific validation to economic reality. The corporate market functions on a very simple premise. You either create a new revenue stream or you eliminate an existing financial liability. Nolan explained the specific utility of my research. He stated that international regulatory agencies were preparing to impose staggering carbon tariffs on traditional synthetic packaging. The current commercial infrastructure required centuries to process plastic waste. The disposal bottleneck cost the global manufacturing sector 10 digits every fiscal quarter. Your chemical structure neutralizes the primary bottleneck, Nolan stated. The ability to degrade industrial polymers into organic residue within 18 days is a paradigm shift. My firm intends to lead that shift. We do not want to compete with your holding company on the open market. We want to secure the exclusive manufacturing rights for the North American and European sectors before your legal team opens the floor to international bidding. The surrounding crowd of wealthy alumni grew entirely silent. The local property developers and regional investors realized they were witnessing a tier of business they rarely encountered. They were watching a multinational conglomerate negotiate a global acquisition next to a table of hors d'oeuvres. The men who had ignored Preston moments ago now shifted their physical orientation to face me. The social hierarchy of the room realigned itself in a matter of seconds. I maintained a neutral expression. I did not smile. I did not look at my parents to gauge their reaction. I kept my focus locked on the acquisition director. I requested the initial terms of his proposed agreement. Nolan did not engage in preliminary bartering. He operated on a scale that required immediate clarity. He offered a comprehensive licensing contract. He stated the conglomerate would absorb all manufacturing, logistics, distribution costs, and secondary regulatory fees. In exchange, my holding company would receive a fixed percentage of the gross global savings generated by the enzyme. We are prepared to issue a baseline royalty structure, Nolan announced. The initial valuation guarantees $25 million a year. The number echoed across the polished marble floor. $25 million. It was not a speculative company valuation. It was not a volatile stock option. It was a direct annual royalty yield. The sheer scale of the wealth defied standard suburban comprehension. The figure landed in the center of the Coleman family like a physical weight. I observed the immediate physical deterioration of my relatives from my peripheral vision. The blood drained from my father's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. Richard opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. His mind attempted to process the math. He was currently facing a public foreclosure due to a defaulted commercial loan. He was drowning in a fraction of the money Nolan just offered me as a baseline starting point. The daughter he advised to seek entry-level employment possessed an earning potential that dwarfed his entire logistical career. Evelyn gripped her designer handbag until her knuckles turned white. The realization fractured her curated reality. She had spent the last 4 years orchestrating a vicious smear campaign against me. She told her country club friends I was a selfish failure. She lied to our extended relatives to protect the illusion of her successful son. Now she stood in a room full of the elite society she worshipped and listened to a corporate giant value my intellect at $25 million. The science project she despised was a global asset. Preston stood behind my father holding a crystal glass of sparkling wine. The golden child had built his entire identity on the premise that he was the superior sibling. He relied on my forced subjugation to maintain his fragile confidence. He needed me to be poor so he could feel rich. The venture capitalists in the room had already rejected his hollow buzzwords. The market had already exposed his marketing firm as a toxic liability. Hearing the royalty valuation severed the final thread of his delusion. The muscles in Preston's hand lost their tension. His fingers went slack. The crystal glass slipped from his grip. It fell through the air and struck the polished marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass sliced through the quiet reception hall. The crystal shattered, sending bright shards sliding across the floor tiles. It was a fitting auditory manifestation of his ruined hierarchy. The golden child was bankrupt and holding an empty hand while the discarded scapegoat was negotiating an empire. Preston stared at the broken glass near his expensive leather shoes. He did not bend down to clean it up. He lacked the basic functional skills to handle his own mess. He looked small and entirely broken. Audrey stood frozen near the edge of the group holding her smartphone. She had lowered the camera. There was no digital angle that could spin this reality into a positive social media post. I turned my attention back to Nolan. I did not express gratitude for the offer. In the corporate sector, expressing premature gratitude signals a willingness to accept less than your actual value. I treated the $25 million as a reasonable starting parameter. I nodded my head once. My legal counsel operates out of Chicago, I told him. My voice remained steady and professional. You can forward the preliminary term sheet to their office on Monday morning. We will review the licensing parameters and schedule a formal negotiation. Nolan offered a brief, respectful nod. He appreciated a counterpart who understood the mechanics of the transaction. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a sealed envelope containing his direct contact information. He excused himself and walked back toward the heavy wooden doors exiting the Alumni Center with the same predatory efficiency he used to enter. The reception hall remained still for a moment before the ambient chatter slowly resumed. The tone of the room had changed. The regional investors and wealthy alumni cast calculating glances in my direction. They viewed me through a new lens. I looked at my family. The physical barrier they formed around me moments earlier now felt like a prison they had built for themselves. They were trapped in the corner of the room, surrounded by the debris of their shattered expectations. The transition was complete. The control mechanism they relied on for nearly 3 decades was permanently disabled. The psychological pivot of a narcissistic unit facing sudden wealth is a predictable phenomenon. They do not experience remorse for their past abuse. They experience a severe sense of entitlement. As the shock began to recede from my father's face, I saw a new calculation forming in his eyes. The panic regarding his defaulted loan was replaced by a dark, greedy hunger. They were preparing to rewrite history. They were preparing to lay claim to the fortune I built in the shadows. The confrontation at the Alumni Center was finished, but the true audit of the Coleman family was just beginning. The drive back to the suburban estate was defined by a suffocating silence. Richard gripped the leather steering wheel of his luxury vehicle with white knuckles. Evelyn stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. Preston sat in the back seat staring down at his hands. The air inside the cabin felt thick with the weight of unearned wealth. They had just witnessed a corporate titan validate my intellect at a baseline valuation of $25 million. They were returning to a house carrying a defaulted commercial loan. The contrast between my new reality and their impending ruin generated a profound cognitive dissonance. A healthy mind encountering a failure of this magnitude would experience deep remorse. A rational parent would reflect on the years of neglect and feel a crushing wave of guilt. Narcissistic family structures do not possess the capacity for remorse. Guilt requires empathy, and empathy requires the ability to decenter the self. When faced with an irrefutable defeat, they execute a rapid psychological pivot. They bypass accountability and arrive directly at entitlement. They walked through the front door of the estate, The foyer was dark. A stack of unpaid utility bills and legal notices rested on the entryway console. Richard walked straight to the formal living room and poured a large measure of scotch. He did not sit down. He paced the length of the Persian rug. The shock of the reception hall was fading. A dark, calculating hunger began to replace his initial terror. He needed to reconcile his patriarchal authority with his current insolvency. He achieved this by rewriting the fundamental nature of our relationship. He spoke aloud to the empty room, translating basic parental obligations into a venture capital seed investment. Richard convinced himself that providing a roof over my head during my childhood constituted an early-stage equity stake in my future earnings. He reasoned that the food I consumed and the public school education I received were not the baseline requirements of raising a child. He classified them as initial startup capital. In his mind, my doctoral research was a direct product of the Coleman household infrastructure. Therefore, he was legally and morally entitled to a significant percentage of the licensing royalties. He was not a father begging a discarded daughter for a bailout. He was an initial investor demanding his rightful dividend. Evelyn sat on the white leather sofa and quickly adopted this revised history. She needed to protect her identity as the superior matriarch. If I achieved global success independently, it meant her maternal influence was irrelevant. She could not tolerate irrelevance. She decided her constant mockery and emotional neglect were actually calculated parenting strategies. She claimed her strictness provided the vital friction required to forge my scientific discipline. She told Richard that if she had coddled me the way she coddled Preston, I never would have developed the resilience to engineer the synthetic enzyme. She seamlessly transformed a history of abuse into a narrative of supportive sacrifice. Evelyn convinced herself she was the secret catalyst behind the international patent. She viewed her cruelty as a necessary coaching tactic. This historical revisionism acts as an essential survival mechanism for manipulators. They must alter the past to secure a comfortable position in the present. By rewriting the narrative, they relieved themselves of any lingering shame and justified their impending extortion. Preston retreated to his childhood bedroom and shut the door. He lacked the mental fortitude to participate in the strategic planning. He preferred to hide while his parents constructed a safety net on his behalf. The weekend unfolded as an exercise in shared delusion. Richard and Evelyn cleared the mahogany dining table. They did not use the space to organize their belongings for the upcoming foreclosure eviction. They used the table to draft a comprehensive financial plan, dictating how they would distribute my corporate royalties. They brought out legal pads and silver pens. They treated the $25 million valuation as an incoming wire transfer, directed straight into their joint checking account. I was not present in the room, but the psychological data I gathered later painted a clear picture of their activities. They created a ledger of demands. The first line item on their list involved curing the commercial default on the estate. Richard calculated the exact sum required to satisfy the bank and remove the foreclosure threat. He factored in the late fees and the legal penalties without a hint of hesitation. He assumed my wealth existed to erase his poor risk management. The second line item focused on Preston's lifestyle marketing firm. Evelyn insisted her golden son needed a substantial capital injection to overcome his temporary market setback. They allocated $2 million of my pending contract to save his leased office space and clear his vendor debts. They wrote the number down with fluid ease. They believed a fraction of my corporate licensing agreement could breathe life into a venture that held zero tangible value. They did not stop at debt consolidation. The entitlement metastasized rapidly. Evelyn began planning a full renovation of the estate kitchen. She discussed importing Italian marble and upgrading the appliances. Richard researched premium golf course memberships in neighboring states. They spent Saturday and Sunday spending money they had not earned and did not possess. They designed a future built entirely on the forced liquidation of my intellect. Their strategy relied on an outdated understanding of our power dynamic. They believed they could reel me back into the enmeshed family system using biological guilt. They assumed the title of parent granted them unconditional access to my treasury. They thought a stern tone and a reminder of family loyalty would override any boundaries I attempted to establish. They intended to summon me to the estate and present their financial demands under the guise of an executive family alignment. They failed to recognize a crucial variable in their calculation. The control mechanics they utilized during my childhood were permanently broken. You cannot leverage a fear of abandonment against an individual who has already accepted the isolation. You cannot use the threat of medical debt against an individual holding a global corporate contract. They were preparing to negotiate with a frightened graduate student. They did not understand they were about to face a forensic auditor. By Sunday evening, the legal pads were filled with their delusional allocations. Richard felt a renewed sense of patriarchal dominance. Evelyn felt the comforting warmth of unearned security. They looked at the numbers and smiled. They believed the crisis was averted. The golden child would be rescued, and their social standing would be preserved. They just needed to formalize the transaction. Richard opened his laptop to draft the summons. He did not write a congratulatory message. He did not express pride regarding the international patent. He crafted an email utilizing the cold, authoritative language of a chief executive, calling a subordinate to the boardroom. He intended to issue the message on Monday morning, ensuring I understood the urgency of his request. He believed the digital command would force my immediate compliance. The suburban house sat quiet under the Sunday night sky. The parents slept soundly, convinced their financial rescue was guaranteed. They were oblivious to the reality waiting for them. The trap they spent the weekend building was entirely constructed of fragile assumptions. They were about to invite me into their home to demand a portion of my empire. They were handing me the exact opportunity I needed to execute the final stage of their audit. The stage was set for a confrontation that would dismantle their revised history and expose the raw, undeniable truth of their insolvency. The transition from a cramped studio apartment to a corporate suite requires a fundamental shift in sensory processing. I sat behind a polished glass desk on the 34th floor of a commercial high-rise in downtown Columbus. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the Scioto River. The faint hum of centralized climate control replaced the rattling vibrations of the industrial washing machines I used to endure. The Delaware holding company Silas helped me establish provided the necessary capital to secure a physical headquarters. I was no longer a sleep-deprived graduate student running centrifuge tests in the dark. I was the chief executive of a bioresearch firm holding a global licensing contract. The environment reflected my new reality. The space was sterile, quiet, and entirely under my control. At exactly 9 a.m, my computer chimed. I opened the secure inbox. A message from Richard Coleman sat at the top of the queue. The subject line read, "Mandatory Family Alignment and Equity Distribution." I clicked the cursor and opened the text. I read the words my father had drafted during his weekend of shared delusion. The syntax was a masterclass in narcissistic entitlement. Richard bypassed any standard greeting. He did not ask how I was adjusting to my postgraduate life. He offered zero apologies for boycotting my thesis defense. He made no mention of the years he spent calling my research a useless project. The message was structured like a corporate memorandum issued to a subordinate employee. He wrote that the family required an immediate summit at the estate to finalize the equity shares of my recent patent success. He explicitly stated that Preston needed a capital injection of $2 million to secure his business legacy before the end of the fiscal quarter. The specific arrangement of his vocabulary fascinated me. He used the phrase equity shares as if he held a seat on my board of directors. He framed the $2 million not as a desperate bailout for a failing son, but as a necessary investment in the Coleman legacy. He was attempting to translate his catastrophic parenting failures into a boardroom negotiation. He assumed the biological title of father granted him unilateral access to the treasury I built with Silas. He believed that invoking the concept of family equity would trigger a dormant sense of obligation. In the past, an email like this might have triggered a visceral reaction. The younger version of me might have felt a surge of hot defensive anger. I would have drafted a dozen replies trying to explain the injustice of his demands. Anger is an emotion that signifies a lingering attachment. It indicates that you still want the abuser to understand your pain and validate your perspective. I read the email a second time and felt no anger. I felt a cold, impenetrable calm. The emotional tether was truly severed. I viewed Richard and Evelyn not as parents, but as hostile entities attempting to breach my corporate perimeter. You do not negotiate with hostile entities using emotion. You neutralize them using forensic data. I opened my digital directory and located the contact file for Julian. Julian was the senior corporate attorney managing the legal architecture of my holding company. He was a man who viewed human sentiment as a variable that cluttered clean math. He spent his career dismantling over-leveraged portfolios and protecting intellectual property from hostile takeovers. He operated with clinical detachment. I forwarded my father's email to Julian's private address. I picked up my desk phone and dialed his direct extension. Julian answered on the first ring. I did not offer pleasantries or explain the familial context of the situation. I gave him a set of precise instructions. I told him to initiate a comprehensive extraction of my parents' public financial footprint. I needed the original deed to the suburban estate. I needed the commercial loan agreements bearing my father's signature. I needed the notice of default filed by the bank. I required the documents detailing the exact date the foreclosure proceedings would commence. I did not stop at my parents' liabilities. I requested a full civil court sweep on Preston's lifestyle marketing firm. I told Julian to locate every pending vendor lawsuit, every unpaid commercial lease, and every recorded judgment against my brother's company. I wanted the complete anatomy of their insolvency laid bare on paper. Julian did not ask questions regarding my biological relationship to the targets. He treated the request as a standard vulnerability assessment. I instructed him to print certified notarized copies of every single document. I wanted the raised seals visible on the paper. I wanted the ink dark and legible. I told him to place the paperwork inside a sterile black briefcase. Narcissists rely on gaslighting to control the narrative. They deny reality and twist history to suit their immediate needs. You cannot argue with them using logic because they will simply invent new facts. The only way to silence a manipulator is to present physical, irrefutable proof of their failures. Certified court documents cannot be gaslit. A bank default cannot be rewritten by a weeping mother or an arrogant father. The data is immune to their emotional extortion. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my monitor. I typed a brief response to my father's email. I confirmed my attendance for Tuesday evening at 7. I kept the message limited to a single sentence. I offered no hints regarding my actual intent. I did not demand an apology or question his authority. Let them believe their summons was successful. Let Evelyn plan her kitchen renovations, and let Richard practice his patriarchal demands. Let Preston believe his rescue was imminent. The concept of a mandatory family meeting is a tactical maneuver designed to exert dominance. By ordering me to the estate, they were forcing me onto their home turf. They believed the physical environment of my childhood would regress my psychological state. They assumed the mahogany dining table and the familiar walls would strip away my executive authority and reduce me back to the obedient scapegoat. They intended to use the setting to amplify their pressure and extract a fraction of my empire to pave over the wreckage of their own mistakes. They expected me to walk through the front door carrying a checkbook and a lifetime of conditioned guilt. They were entirely unaware that the power dynamic had shifted beyond their comprehension. I was not attending a family dinner. I was attending a corporate liquidation. I was bringing an objective witness who specialized in exposing fraud. I was bringing the raw, undeniable proof of their insolvency. The meeting was set, but the agenda belonged entirely to me. I closed my email client and returned to my structural engineering files. The silent hustle was over, and the time for the forensic confrontation had arrived. Tuesday evening cast a long shadow across the suburban streets of Ohio. I navigated my vehicle through the familiar winding roads of the neighborhood where I spent my childhood. Julian sat in the passenger seat wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He held a sterile black briefcase resting flat across his knees. We did not engage in casual conversation during the commute. The parameters of the evening required silent focus. I pulled up to the curb outside the Coleman estate and turned off the ignition. The exterior of the property told a detailed story of financial rot. A house serves as a physical manifestation of its owner's solvency. The facade that once projected status now projected exhaustion. The manicured lawn featured tall weeds and dry yellow patches, indicating they terminated the landscaping contract months ago. The hedges bordering the brick walkway were untrimmed and overgrown, obscuring the front windows. The brass house numbers fixed next to the door lacked their usual polish. The estate looked like an asset buckling under the weight of an unserviceable debt. We walked up the cracked concrete path and I rang the doorbell. The heavy oak door swung inward. Evelyn stood in the threshold, projecting an artificial welcoming smile. She wore a cashmere cardigan and pearl earrings, attempting to maintain her country club aesthetic. Her eyes met mine, conveying a synthetic warmth designed to lure me inside the trap. Then her gaze shifted to the man standing beside me. The smile fractured instantly. The muscles in her jaw tightened. She recognized the threat of an unknown variable. Narcissists choreograph their ambushes with precise environmental control. They isolate the target on familiar terrain to maximize emotional pressure. The introduction of a third party disrupts their tactical advantage. She looked at Julian's suit and the briefcase in his hand. Her maternal routine vanished, replaced by sharp suspicion. She stepped aside to grant us entry without offering a verbal greeting. The air inside the foyer felt stale. It lacked the scent of fresh flowers she usually displayed to impress visitors. I noticed a rectangular outline on the wallpaper above the entryway console. A valuable antique mirror used to hang in that exact spot. Its absence suggested they were quietly liquidating household decor to cover immediate living expenses. Evelyn led us down the hallway and into the formal dining room without uttering a single word. The mahogany table served as the staging ground for their extortion attempt. Richard occupied the head chair, presiding over the room like a judge evaluating a subordinate. Preston sat to his right, and Audrey sat to his left. They formed a unified physical barrier at the far end of the room. The visual arrangement resembled a tribunal preparing to collect an overdue debt. Richard poured a glass of cheap grocery store wine. His posture was rigid. He did not stand to welcome his daughter. Preston tapped his fingers rhythmically against the table, projecting a nervous energy he tried to hide behind a confident smirk. Audrey held her phone, ignoring the tension permeating the space. I pulled out a chair near the opposite end of the long table. Julian took the seat next to me, placing the black briefcase face down near his hands. Richard stared at Julian with open hostility. He bypassed any pretense of familial affection and addressed the disruption directly. He demanded to know why a stranger was sitting at his dining table during a private family summit. He attempted to use a booming tone to intimidate the outsider and regain control of the environment. He stated that Coleman business required strict confidentiality. I looked at my father, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I explained that Julian was my senior corporate counsel. I informed the room that I brought him to record the exact terms of their proposed equity distribution. The statement functioned as a psychological lock. I used their own vocabulary against them. I fed them the premise they wanted to hear. The Colemans operated on pure entitlement. They heard the phrase equity distribution, and their greed overrode their caution. They mistook my procedural preparation for submission. They assumed I brought a lawyer to draft the legal transfers they intended to demand. The hostility on my father's face dissolved into a look of triumphant satisfaction. He believed his commanding email had successfully terrified me into compliance. Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. He cleared his throat and initiated his rehearsed monologue. He adopted the grave, measured cadence of a patriarch delivering profound wisdom. He started by discussing the current economic climate, characterizing Preston's catastrophic failure as a minor industry headwind. He claimed the lifestyle marketing firm was on the verge of securing vital corporate partnerships, but required a temporary bridge to finalize the contracts. He wove a tapestry of minor euphemisms to disguise a major fraud. He painted Preston not as a liability, but as a misunderstood visionary facing a temporary cash flow delay. He shifted the focus toward my recent corporate success. He spoke about the Coleman legacy and the foundational support the family provided me during my youth. He claimed that true wealth was not measured by individual patents or licensing agreements. He stated that true wealth was measured by how effectively a person lifts up their siblings. He wove a narrative of biological duty, implying that my intelligence was a communal resource meant to be harvested for the benefit of the group. He told me that family members must share the harvest when one of them strikes gold. He argued that my doctoral research was a direct byproduct of the environment he funded. Evelyn nodded in agreement from her standing position near the sideboard. She chimed in to reinforce the narrative. She claimed her maternal guidance kept me focused during my academic struggles. She stated the family endured significant sacrifices to ensure I had the freedom to study biodegradable polymers. It was a staggering display of historical revisionism. They were actively erasing years of mockery and neglect to position themselves as the silent architects of my synthetic enzyme. Richard folded his hands together. He looked me directly in the eyes and delivered the formal demand. He announced that to properly manage the family legacy and ensure Preston's firm reached its full potential, they required a designated ownership stake in my holding company. He did not ask for a modest sum to clear a single debt. He officially demanded a 30% equity share of the global patent royalties. He stated the transfer must be executed by the end of the week to stabilize their assets and fund Preston's operational budget. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. They were drowning in a commercial default initiated by the son sitting at the table. They possessed zero legal claim to my intellectual property. They contributed nothing to my research except disparagement. Yet they sat there with straight faces expecting me to hand over millions of dollars to fund a lifestyle they had not earned. Preston smiled, leaning back in his chair, convinced his rescue was imminent. Evelyn watched me closely, anticipating my capitulation. Audrey finally put her phone down, waiting for the transaction to conclude. They thought the negotiation phase was finished. They had no idea the audit was just beginning. I sat in the high-backed dining chair and let the echo of my father's demand settle over the room. 30%. The number was a monument to their entitlement. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He wore the expression of a successful negotiator concluding a routine merger. He fully expected me to produce a pen and ask for the legal transfer documents. Evelyn stood near the sideboard, holding her breath in anticipation of the payout. Preston adjusted his collar, looking like a man who just secured a winning lottery ticket. Audrey placed her phone face down on the table, assuming the boring financial discussion was nearing its conclusion. They believed the transaction was complete. They assumed my silence indicated submission to their inherent authority. I counted 5 seconds in my head, allowing their confidence to reach its peak. Then I turned my head slightly to the right. I gave Julian a single silent nod. Julian did not hesitate. He placed the sterile black briefcase flat on the mahogany table. The metallic snap of the brass latches opening sounded like a gunshot in the quiet dining room. Evelyn flinched at the sharp noise. Richard frowned, leaning forward again to inspect the contents of the briefcase. He expected to see corporate banking forms or a checkbook ready to be signed. He did not expect to see a thick stack of certified public records. Julian extracted the paperwork. The pages were heavy and bound with legal clips. The raised, tactile impression of the notary seals caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Julian set the stack directly in the center of the table, equidistant from every person in the room. He did not speak. He folded his hands and returned to his passive, observing posture. I reached out and placed my right hand flat on top of the documents. The paper felt cold and solid under my palm. I looked directly into my father's eyes. The time for polite observation was over. The audit required execution. I do not negotiate equity distributions, I stated. My voice was stripped of any familial warmth. It carried the sterile precision of a corporate deposition. And I certainly do not entertain financial partnerships with individuals who are currently in default on a secondary commercial mortgage. The dining room descended into a terrified, paralyzing silence. The ambient hum of the suburban evening seemed to evaporate from the air. Richard stopped breathing. The confident patriarch routine crumbled in a matter of seconds. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords seized, preventing any sound from escaping. Evelyn gripped the edge of the wooden sideboard to steady her balance. The phrase secondary commercial mortgage dismantled her curated reality. They thought their financial sins were a closely guarded secret. They believed their country club facade was impenetrable to outside observers. They did not understand that public records are transparent to anyone who knows where to look. I separated the top document from the stack. I slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my father. It was the formal notice of default filed in the county civil court system. I informed the room that my corporate counsel conducted a routine vulnerability assessment prior to our meeting. Julian pulled your entire public financial footprint, I explained. You do not possess a family legacy to manage. You possess a ledger of toxic liabilities. I read the numbers aloud. I detailed the exact amount of capital they liquidated from their primary retirement accounts over the past 24 months. I cited the specific dates they authorized the transfers to fund Preston's leased office space and his networking mixers. I exposed the mathematics of their ruin. You drained your life savings to finance a vaporware company. I continued, keeping my gaze locked on Richard. When the liquid assets ran dry, you forged a secondary line of credit using the equity of this estate as collateral. You have missed 3 consecutive repayment deadlines. The commercial lender initiated the pre-foreclosure process 14 days ago. You have exactly 90 days to cure the arrears before the bank places this property on the public auction block. You did not summon me here to share the harvest of my intellect. You summoned me here because you are 3 months away from an eviction notice and you need a bailout. Richard stared at the notice of default. The paper rested on the mahogany table like a live explosive. He did not reach out to touch it. He seemed to believe that if he kept his hands folded, the legal reality of his impending foreclosure might simply evaporate. He looked at Julian and then back to me. The booming patriarchal voice he utilized moments earlier was gone. The silence in the room was dense and suffocating. Preston attempted to intervene. The golden child recognized his safety net was disintegrating before his eyes. He pushed his chair back and stood up. He pointed a finger at Julian, attempting to project outrage to mask his terror. "This is a temporary cash flow hurdle," Preston stammered. His voice cracked, betraying his rising panic. "You do not understand the startup sector, Athena. We are pivoting our brand strategy. We are negotiating with angel investors right now. The firm is solid. We just need a minor bridge loan to stabilize the overhead until the contract's clear." I silenced my brother with a single sustained look. I did not raise my voice to shout him down. I looked at him with the cold, analytical pity reserved for a failing asset. I removed the second document from the stack and slid it toward his side of the table. "You are not negotiating with angel investors, Preston," I stated. "You are dodging process servers. I instructed Julian to run a civil court sweep on your lifestyle marketing firm. Your company possesses 0 liquid assets. Your corporate accounts are currently overdrawn. Your vendor invoices remain unpaid. You do not have a brand strategy." I highlighted the most devastating revelation hidden in the legal paperwork. I exposed the pending civil litigation hanging over his operation. "You are currently facing 3 separate lawsuits for intellectual property theft," I revealed. "Because you lack the actual talent to design your own marketing campaigns, you stole proprietary graphics and branding materials from independent creators on the internet. You stripped their watermarks and presented their portfolios to local businesses as your own creation. You did this to impress your fake social media followers and secure local consulting fees. Those independent designers pooled their resources and retained a litigation firm, I explained. They filed copyright infringement lawsuits against your limited liability corporation last month. They are seeking punitive damages. The legal discovery phase will pierce your corporate veil and expose your personal liability. The court will freeze your remaining accounts by the end of the week. You are not a visionary founder. You are a fraud facing imminent bankruptcy. Preston sank back into his chair. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. The illusion he spent his entire adult life cultivating was shattered into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. Audrey stared at her brother with wide, unblinking eyes. The brand ambassador finally understood she was promoting a sinking ship. She slowly pushed her smartphone away from her as if the device itself was contaminated. Evelyn covered her face with her hands, letting out a quiet, muffled sob. The truth was an invasive force that stripped away their suburban camouflage. They could no longer hide behind venture capital buzzwords or designer clothing. The raw, undeniable mathematics of their failure sat on the table for everyone to see. I remained seated, absorbing the shift in the atmospheric pressure. They orchestrated this evening to assert their dominance. They assumed the physical environment of my childhood home would trigger my old conditioning. They expected me to shrink under my father's demands and sacrifice my hard-earned corporate capital to maintain their fragile status. They thought they were summoning a subordinate daughter to a predictable ambush. They did not realize they had invited a corporate liquidator into their home to execute their final ruin. The old control mechanics were dead. The scapegoat they designated to carry their shame was now the architect dictating their reality. The initial shock of the foreclosure revelation paralyzed the room for a full minute. Then the secondary defense mechanism activated. Evelyn dropped her hands from her face. She did not attempt to argue the mathematics of the defaulted commercial loan. She understood that arguing numbers with an auditor was a losing strategy. She pivoted to the only currency she possessed. She began to weep. The performance was highly theatrical. Her shoulders heaved with exaggerated force. She produced loud, ragged sobs designed to fill the dining room and command the attention of everyone present. Evelyn pointed a shaking finger at me across the mahogany table. She accused me of behaving like a machine. She claimed my sudden corporate success had stripped away my humanity. She leaned over the polished wood and begged me to look around the room. She invoked the history of the property to weaponize my nostalgia. She reminded me that I took my first steps in the adjacent hallway. She talked about the summer birthdays we celebrated in the backyard. She pleaded with me to save the childhood home from the auction block. She painted a tragic picture of an elderly couple being thrown out onto the street. I sat in my chair and observed the physical mechanics of her crying. I noted the specific pitch of her voice and the rhythmic intake of her breath. A guilt trip is an extortion tactic disguised as vulnerability. When a manipulator loses control of the facts, they attempt to short-circuit your logical processing by flooding the environment with distress signals. They expect you to surrender your boundaries simply to make the crying stop. The younger version of myself would have crumbled under the weight of her performance. The current version of myself recognized the tears as a final, desperate maneuver. I maintained a calm, neutral posture. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not offer a tissue. "Your tears are an ineffective strategy, Mom," I stated. My voice cut through her loud sobs with clinical precision. Tears are a biological response to unexpected trauma. You are not experiencing trauma right now. You are experiencing the predictable outcome of your own financial choices. You chose to mortgage this house to fund a fraudulent marketing firm. You placed the deed on a roulette wheel, and the wheel landed on a loss. Do not ask me to cover your bad bet. Evelyn gasped. The volume of her crying diminished instantly. She realized the emotional extortion was failing to produce the desired result. Richard found his voice. He slammed his palm against the table, rattling the empty wine glasses. He attempted to summon a final surge of patriarchal authority. He demanded that I stop treating my own parents like hostile corporate entities. He ordered Julian to pack up the briefcase and leave his property. He insisted that the Coleman wealth belonged to the Coleman family, and he would retain a legal team to secure his rightful percentage of the global patent royalties. Richard believed he could still leverage a civil lawsuit to force a settlement. He assumed my holding company was vulnerable to familial claims. He did not realize the defensive perimeter was designed by someone who understood his tactics better than anyone else. I reached into the black briefcase resting near Julian's hand. I retrieved a single sheet of heavy legal paper. I slid the final document across the table. It came to rest next to the notice of default. This paper did not originate from the county civil court. It was a localized contract drafted by a specialized trust attorney in Chicago. "Read the signature line at the bottom of the page, Dad," I instructed him. Richard narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward and inspected the ink. His jaw went slack. The signature did not belong to me or to Julian. The signature belonged to Silas Coleman. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway leading from the foyer. The sound of thick leather boots stepping onto the hardwood floor broke the silence. The dining room entrance darkened as a figure stepped into the doorway. Silas entered the room. He wore his familiar denim overalls and a faded flannel shirt. He looked entirely out of place in the formal dining room staged with imported porcelain and crystal chandeliers. Yet he commanded the space with a quiet, undeniable authority. Richard stared at the patriarch of the family in sheer terror. Evelyn covered her mouth, stifling a genuine gasp of shock. They thought Silas was sitting in isolation on his rural farm hours away from their suburban crisis. They had no idea he was waiting in the front hallway listening to every word of their extortion attempt. Silas walked slowly toward the head of the table. He did not look at Preston or Audrey. He fixed his sharp, clear eyes directly on Richard. The older man possessed a perspective forged through decades of grueling logistical work. Silas grew up during an economic recession. He built a regional shipping network by identifying structural rot and cutting it out before it could infect the entire operation. He knew how to spot a failing asset. He recognized the rot in his own son decades ago, but chose to observe from a distance. Tonight he was stepping in to finalize the audit. "You came to my farm last week and handed me a fabricated business plan," Silas said. His gravelly voice filled the room. "You lied to my face. You tried to disguise a defaulted bank loan as a strategic expansion opportunity. You thought I was a senile old man you could trick into funding your vanity. When I refused to write the check, you immediately turned around and tried to devour your own daughter." Richard swallowed hard. He attempted to formulate an excuse, but his throat was dry. "Dad, please," he whispered. "We are just trying to keep the legacy intact. We need to restructure our assets." "You have no assets to restructure," Silas countered. He placed a calloused hand on the back of Richard's chair. "I watched you enable that boy for 20 years. Silas pointed a rough finger at Preston. "I watched you fund his cars and his expensive clothes while Athena worked dawn shifts in a laboratory. You treated her intellect like an embarrassment because it exposed your own lack of substance. You created a toxic financial ecosystem, and now it is collapsing on top of you." Silas turned his attention to the legal document resting on the mahogany table. He explained the mechanics of the trap they had just walked into. "I funded the global patent filings," Silas announced. "I provided the capital to secure the Delaware holding company, and I retained the intellectual property attorneys in Chicago. I did not set up a standard corporate registry. I established an impenetrable trust structure. The legal framework explicitly excludes the Coleman lineage from accessing any portion of the licensing royalties. The contract dictates that Richard, Evelyn, and Preston are permanently barred from claiming a single cent of the revenue generated by the synthetic enzyme." The patriarch delivered the final blow without a trace of hesitation. He officially sanctioned their ruin. "You will not sue her for a settlement," Silas stated. "You will not extract a percentage of her global contract. You will sit here and face the eviction notice you earned. The bank will take this house. Preston's firm will dissolve under the weight of civil litigation. I am cutting off your access to my estate advances effective immediately. You are finally going to experience the real world you kept telling Athena to enter." The air in the dining room grew cold. The reality of their situation settled into their bones. They were stripped of their leverage, their wealth, and their social standing. The patriarch they attempted to swindle had engineered their permanent quarantine. They possessed zero escape routes. I pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. Julian stood in unison, snapping the latches of the sterile black briefcase shut. He left the certified public records and the legal relinquishment forms resting in a neat stack on the polished wood. I looked down at the people who had spent my entire youth conditioning me to accept less than I deserved. I did not feel a desire to gloat. I felt the quiet resolution of an equation balancing itself out. You invited me here to collect a debt I did not owe, I told my family. You expected me to build a foundation beneath your sinking ship. But a wise investor never throws clean capital into a contaminated venture. This family dynamic is the most toxic asset I have ever audited. I am officially closing the account. I turned my back on the mahogany table. I walked toward the hallway alongside Silas and Julian. I did not look over my shoulder to witness my father's stunned silence or my mother's renewed weeping. I navigated the foyer of my childhood home for the final time. I reached the heavy oak front door and turned the brass handle. I stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the ruins of their suburban illusion behind me. The silent hustle was finished, and the era of my global empire had officially begun. The progression of time serves as the ultimate forensic auditor. It does not accept emotional excuses, and it does not grant extensions based on familial manipulation. 6 months passed since the confrontation in the suburban dining room. The distance provided a clear lens to evaluate the final trajectory of the Coleman family. The structural collapse they feared arrived with mathematical certainty. I did not need to contact my former relatives to verify their status. The public records generated by the Ohio civil court system chronicled their downfall with unbiased accuracy. The civil litigation filed against Preston's lifestyle marketing firm proceeded without delay. The independent designers he defrauded retained exceptional legal counsel. During the discovery phase, the presiding judge reviewed the internal corporate communications and the forged portfolio materials. The court pierced the corporate veil of his limited liability company, exposing his personal assets to the impending judgment. The ruling was terminal. The judge awarded punitive damages to the plaintiffs and ordered the immediate liquidation of Preston's remaining business accounts. His company dissolved into a stack of legal penalties and outstanding vendor debts. The visionary founder who refused to work a traditional schedule was forced to face the reality of the labor market. He possessed no authentic skills and a ruined credit score. Today, my older brother works an entry-level management position at a mid-tier retail clothing store inside a suburban shopping mall. He spends his 40-hour workweek organizing inventory bins and processing customer returns. He wears a synthetic uniform shirt. He answers directly to a shift supervisor who is 5 years younger than him. The poetic justice of his situation is precise. He spent his entire youth pretending to be a chief executive and handing out glossy business cards. Now he stands behind a cash register listening to college students dictate his lunch breaks. Richard and Evelyn faced a similar unyielding reckoning. The commercial lender did not entertain their requests for a forbearance. The bank executed the foreclosure protocol and seized the estate. The sprawling property went to public auction on a rainy Tuesday morning. A corporate real estate developer purchased the lot and immediately gutted the interior of my childhood home. My parents were forced to host a humiliating estate sale to cover their moving expenses. They sold the mahogany dining table and the imported porcelain they used to project their superiority. They relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in an undesirable zip code far outside their preferred neighborhood. The unit borders a loud interstate highway mirroring the exact living conditions they once deemed suitable for my existence. The transition exposed the hollow nature of their social network. Country club friendships are transactional alliances built on proximity and perceived wealth. When my parents could no longer afford the monthly membership dues, their peers stopped calling. The invitations ceased. The local gossips who eagerly participated in Evelyn's smear campaign against me found new targets to discuss. Richard and Evelyn are currently isolated in a small space, forced to look at each other and acknowledge the wreckage they engineered. They possess no golden child to celebrate and no scapegoat to blame. My current reality is defined entirely by the environment I chose to construct. I relocated my primary operations to a panoramic executive suite on the 42nd floor of a commercial tower in downtown Chicago. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer an uninterrupted view of Lake Michigan. The daily hum of the city operates far below my office. The holding company finalized the licensing agreements with the multinational chemical conglomerate. The transition from the laboratory to the global market was seamless. The synthetic enzyme was deployed across international shipping corridors and industrial manufacturing hubs. The data from the first 2 fiscal quarters confirmed our highest projections. The biochemical catalyst successfully reduced global industrial plastic waste by 40%. The useless science project my mother mocked at a Sunday dinner is currently altering the ecological trajectory of the planet. I do not spend my days defending my intellect. I oversee a dedicated team of 30 senior data scientists and chemical engineers. I am surrounded by colleagues who evaluate my output as a premium resource rather than a disposable convenience. The financial yield of the licensing contract provided an unprecedented surplus of liquid capital. I did not purchase luxury vehicles or sprawling estates to project a specific image. True power does not require a billboard. I collaborated with Grandpa Silas to establish a philanthropic foundation. We structured the organization to bypass standard bureaucratic hurdles. Silas serves as my chief advisory director, operating from his quiet farm in Ohio. We utilize the foundation to allocate vital funding to independent academic researchers who lack the institutional backing to protect their own intellectual property. We provide the legal fortress they need to secure their patents and thrive in the corporate sector. We identify the scapegoats hiding in university laboratories and we hand them the tools to build their own empires. Society conditions individuals to endure toxic behavior under the guise of biological loyalty. We are instructed to excuse financial exploitation and emotional neglect simply because the perpetrators share our genetic sequence. This narrative is a trap designed to keep competent individuals tethered to sinking ships. Families built on a foundation of narcissistic control demand that you shrink your ambitions to accommodate their fragility. They require you to set yourself on fire to keep their illusions warm. Setting a permanent boundary against a toxic family system is never an act of vengeance. It is a fundamental mechanism for survival. You cannot navigate a complex corporate landscape while carrying the dead weight of someone else's delusion. The transition from victim to architect requires you to stop seeking permission from the people who benefit from your subjugation. If you are listening to this, and you have ever had to walk away from a dinner table because your genuine achievements were treated as a threat, I want you to hear this clearly. Your true worth is determined by objective data and unyielding resilience. It is never determined by the people who refuse to see your value. Do not argue with individuals who are committed to misunderstanding you. Present the forensic evidence, secure your perimeter, and let them face the consequences of their own arithmetic. Thank you for spending your time with me today here on Senior Echo Stories. I want to know how you handle boundary setting in your own life. Drop a comment below and tell me the specific moment you realized you had to walk away from a toxic environment. I read every single response and I draw strength from this community. Remember to hit that subscribe button, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.